Good afternoon. I'm Margaret Andreasen, and you are listening to Wisconsin Public Radio. Today, in our own way, we're going to celebrate the 150th birthday of John Muir. We have with us by telephone Stephen Fox. Stephen Fox, author of The American Conservation Movement, John Muir and His Legacy, originally published by Little Brown in 1981 and later republished by the University of Wisconsin Press. In a short time, you'll have a chance to join our conversation to talk also with Stephen Fox. I'd like, though, now to welcome him. Good afternoon, Stephen Fox.
Good afternoon to you, Margaret, and happy birthday to Johnny Muir.
Yes. We're celebrating John Muir's birthday. How long has it been since people did not celebrate that birthday? In other words, was John Muir famous from the beginning?
Not really. Well, he was famous as a young man in the 1870s when he was in his 30s. Then he retired for a while, and then he came back in the 1890s. But I think since then people have known who he was. He was a founder of the Sierra Club, and the club has done a great deal to keep his name alive over the years.
We associate him, I think perhaps because of his time in California and with his association with the Sierra Club, with the West. Will you tell us, please, about his Wisconsin beginnings?
Well, that's where it started. He was born in Scotland and came to Wisconsin in 1849 when he was 11 years old with his family. They homesteaded a couple of farms in Marquette County. And then at the age of 23, he enters the University of Wisconsin as a rather old freshman. And that's where his mind really unfolds. He's only there for a couple of years, but that's where his education really began, and certain patterns emerged there that last all through his life. His passions for geology and botany, his interest in the outdoors in general, and also the change in his religious point of view seems to start around then. One key way of understanding Muir, to me and to some other Muir scholars, it's a matter of some debate, but to me and others who think like me, he was not a Christian, and that's very important, because many people think the Judeo-Christian tradition carries some inherent arrogance toward non-human forms of life, because the Christian notion is that only humans have souls and only humans go to heaven. So there's a corollary notion from that other forms of life are simply here to serve us, that they have no justification beyond whatever use we humans might make of them. Well, that attitude of Muir's, that shift from the Christianity of his youth, the Scotch Presbyterianism of his youth, towards something that is kind of an inchoate paganism and pantheism begins during his Wisconsin years. And that's very important to understand him and to understand the whole movement, it seems to me.
Do we know where from what sources he developed his non-Christian pantheism? Was he influenced by other writers, Emerson, for example?
I don't think so. That's also a matter of some debate. He loved Emerson, met him in Yosemite in 1871 when he was 33 years old, and Thoreau also. Thoreau was his favorite writer in his old age, but it seems to me that he didn't read them until his own ideas were fully formed. He might have picked them up at one remove through a woman named Jean Carr. She was the wife of his chemistry professor at Wisconsin and was the great intellectual influence on his life, especially during the 10 years from about 1865 to 75, a very voluminous correspondence. Jean Carr knew Emerson and knew of Thoreau, and she may have passed those ideas on to him, even though he didn't actually read them until later on. But it seems to me that essentially he was an original, and that his point of view toward nature is something that anyone at any time in any place can intuit simply by going out into the woods or any big swatch of wild land and thinking about things, thinking about this notion of human-centeredness, and is it true that everything is here for human use? And is it true that humans have special privileges because of, a larger forebrain or an opposed thumb or the ability to walk erect or whatever you want to say, or a Christian soul, if you want to think of it in those terms? It seems to me that Muir just went out in the woods and thought about these things and came up with his ideas on his own, and especially on his 1,000-mile walk through the American South in 1867 when he was 29 years old. He records it in his journal, and you can see him by gradual steps during that trip stepping out of the Christian tradition and finally saying, in what seems to me to be his central insight, that the world we are told was made for man, a statement that is totally unsupported by facts. And he goes on from that humans, it seems to him, are just part of the whole scheme with no special privileges and no special prerogatives. And that's a central idea in American environmentalism ever since.
As I look at Wisconsin today, I feel that this is a state that is very sensitive to environmental issues. It's a place in which the environment is taken very, very seriously, in which the beauty and health of nature are very important. And I'm curious about why, finding himself in Wisconsin, he had the need to leave.
That's a tough one. Oh, Jean Carr, that intellectual mentor, had a...
Could I ask you another question about her?
Mm-hmm.
I think while it's quite true that faculty spouses can be very, very intellectual and have real influences on other people, I guess I am a bit surprised that the wife of a chemistry professor would have served that function in Muir's life. How did that come to be?
Well, it wasn't so much while he was in Madison, interestingly enough. It came a few years later. He went to Canada in 1864, apparently to evade the Civil War draft, something that makes him seem very contemporary. And while he was there, he was up in the woods working at a factory, a broom factory, rake factory, and was lonesome, didn't have anyone to talk to. So he writes his old chemistry professor, and the person who writes back is Mrs. Carr, Jean Carr, and that's the start of the correspondence between them. Apparently, he didn't know her that well while he was in Madison. He was very much a hermit and a social misfit, kept to himself, would never come to their home for parties or the like. But in his loneliness in Canada, he writes to her, and that begins the exchange, and it's a wonderful correspondence. There's a book, Letters to a Friend, that has some of Muir's letters, but none of hers. Actually, her letters are out in Muir's papers in California, and you need both sides of it, obviously. But she's the influence. She was a real polymath. She was interested in all sorts of things. Feminism, the occult, political reforms, gardening, Asian religions, psychic phenomena, and all of them were pushed on Muir to greater or lesser effect. But she's the influence.
Now, I interrupted you with that question. You were in the process of suggesting that Jean Carr may have played a very important role in getting Muir off to California.
Yes, well, the story is that Jean Carr had a psychic friend, and this friend had a vision of Muir in Yosemite Valley. This is at a time when he's living in Indianapolis, again working in a factory. He was very much a tinkerer and inventive, good with his hands, mechanical devices of various kinds, and this psychic friend had a vision of Muir in Yosemite. That may have had something to do with it. The other thing is that he had an accident in that factory, nearly lost the sight of one eye, and that eye was always clouded thereafter. When you see photographs of him from the front, that eye is wayward. It's skewed to one side. And he was almost blinded, and it made him think, well, I'd better go out in nature and absorb as much as I can before this sort of thing happens again. So he goes south, makes his walk through the south, ends up in Florida. And it's very much ad hoc, and he never could explain it in later years. He was just sort of drawn to California. He was thinking of going to South America, but instead he got on a boat that took him to Panama, and they crossed Panama, and then took the boat up to California, and he got to California, embarked in San Francisco, and said, tell me where I go that's wild, and the person pointed toward the Sierra. Off he went, and found himself in Yosemite, just like the prophecy said, and felt at home. He was very much a wanderer. He was then, 31 years old, and felt more at home in Yosemite than he had ever felt anywhere. And it was just a kind of a shock of recognition. Stayed there for 4 years, a very crucial 4 years.
From the way in which you describe his lifestyle, he sounds socially irresponsible. He doesn't seem to worry about holding down a job and supporting a family. He gets off in San Francisco and asks, where is the wilderness?
Yeah.
How do you analyze his social function during this period?
He was very much an eccentric. He was the wild man of the mountains up there, engaging in studies in botany and geology, and occasionally writing an article for a newspaper, but not really thinking of a literary career. But there is this other pole. He loved children. He loved the idea of hearth and home, and married quite late. So there are those poles that he keeps bouncing back and forth between. He'd be up in the mountains, and then friends would come up there and meet him and say, come on down to San Francisco. So they'd drag him down to San Francisco, and he'd sort of like it for a while, but then he'd run back to the mountains. And you see the alternation between the two poles makes each seem the more vivid. And when he's in one, he's always exaggerating the harshnesses and the disagreeable aspects of the other. Eventually, he does get domesticated. He marries late in 1880 when he's 42 years old and has 2 children and becomes rather domestic for most of the 1880s. He's running a ranch, a fruit ranch in Martinez, California, which is north of Oakland. And finally gets pulled back into working for the wilderness by an Eastern literary man, Robert Underwood Johnson of the Century magazine. So from the 1890s, he then leaves the ranch and goes back to making his travels and especially becomes a writer, a really well-known writer who's doing books and articles for major literary magazines. But there is always that tension in his character. He always said when you go out in the wilderness, you should go by yourself and you should take your time. He didn't like packs of people in the wilderness. He didn't like people who prided themselves on hiking 40 miles a day. He always said, take your time and watch and listen and open your senses and go alone, because people will just distract you and dilute the experience. And yet, he loved his family, and in certain moods, he was quite gregarious. He loved to sit in someone's parlor and talk for hours. Just this monologue would pour out about stories of the wilderness and theories of geology and glaciers. He loved glaciers. Well, it was an odd way of relating to people. It was just this stream of talk, and he didn't particularly want questions or interruptions, but he liked it. He was always a social eccentric, and I think the essential Muir, the pure Muir, is always the man alone in the wilderness. That's where he was most at home. That was where he was at his best, seems to me.
The person that he reminds us most of, I suppose, is Thoreau.
Yes.
And Thoreau's time at Walden Pond. But Thoreau regarded this as, I think, an experience which would allow him, in effect, to be an artist, to develop a sort of transcendence that he could not in everyday society. How does he differ? How does Muir differ from Thoreau?
I think Muir was wilder. I mean, Thoreau lived in Walden, but then he'd go home to Emerson's for lunch. And Walden, even in the 1840s, was not exactly a wilderness. There was that famous railroad track that runs right by the edge of Walden, bringing the train, and Thoreau uses it as a metaphor for 19th century progress. Thoreau was always kind of human-centered. And Muir was quite the opposite. He thought the whole idea was to lose yourself in the wilderness. And he went to really serious wilderness and stayed there a long time. There is just this hint of human hubris in Thoreau, it seems to me. And Muir's whole point was to lose that. You go out in the wilderness and you realize, paradoxically, both human insignificance and human greatness, because you feel strengthened and emboldened and broadened somehow by feeling yourself less significant. It's a paradox, but that's the feeling he wanted to induce. He was also a more serious botanist, geologist than Thoreau. He made important discoveries about the glaciation in Yosemite. Thoreau was more a brilliant, widely based dilettante when it came to those things. He studied them, he wrote about them, but he didn't make discoveries. He didn't come up with anything very significant in those fields.
Stephen Fox, I want to give our audience a chance to join our conversation here. If you would like to ask this author of the American Conservation Movement, John Muir, and his legacy a question, you can do that by just calling us here at Wisconsin Public Radio. If you're in Madison or Milwaukee, dial 263-1890, 263-1890. And if you're calling from any place else in Wisconsin, you can do that toll-free by using our 800 number. 1-800-642-1234. Again, 1-800-642-1234. I am Margaret Andreasen, back with our guest, author Stephen Fox. Our topic today, John Muir, on this, the 150th birthday of John Muir. How did Muir in his later years get involved in the politics of conservation?
He was hauled into it, kicking and screaming. He hated it, the politicking, the lobbying, the legislature in Sacramento, and the writing letters to Congress and so on. But he just saw it as necessary, and he became famous enough that his name registered on people. Yosemite National Park was established in 1890. It was the second national park in the American system, essentially because of articles that Muir wrote in the Century magazine that Eastern editor I mentioned before, Robert Johnson, hauled out of him. He was a very laborious writer. He spoke so easily in someone's parlor when it was just oral discourse, but when he faced a sheet of paper, he had real writer's cramp. He had to sweat the words out. But he did it, and he did the politicking just because he cared so much about the wilderness. He knew that once he became famous, once his books started coming out from the mid-1890s on, that he could use that fame and name to help the trees and the bears and the waters. And that's why he did it. But he never felt comfortable at it. He never felt comfortable running the Sierra Club. He was president of the Sierra Club for 22 years, and no one could have been less bureaucratic or more disorderly, if you want to put it that way, than Muir. But he did it because he thought it was important, and it was a fine thing on his part.
How has his notion of conservation fared in later years?
It's very interesting. It has a cyclical history, conservation does. It starts out in the 1880s with zealots like Muir, preservationists as they were called later, and then becomes diluted and becomes a quasi-science in the hands of people like Gifford Pinchot and the U.S. Forest Service, and loses that attitude of getting away from human-centeredness. In fact, it becomes just simply an attitude of, yes, humans are still the be-all and end-all, but let's just use everything more prudently and more rationally. So the Muir tradition, that radical preservationist notion that began the movement, goes into eclipse for a long time and then returns in the 1960s. You can see the explosion of the environmental movement in the 1960s as being, in large measure, a return to the Muir spirit. Not necessarily because people knew about Muir or read his stuff or were influenced by it, although many were, but simply because that's the course the movement took. This situation, the environmental decline, had become so acute by then that more radical solutions were needed. So the movement comes back to the Muir spirit, and it's still there. He is still, if anyone is the founding father of American environmentalism, it is Muir. And we are finally starting to see him as that, too. The other story about Muir, just quickly, is that his papers were locked up. His private letters, diaries, and other records were locked up by his family for 60 years after he died. And all we had for those 60 years were two authorized, uncritical biographies that blinked at certain crucial issues. And finally, the papers were opened up in the mid-1970s, and books have appeared since then, mine and others, making use of those papers, and we finally can see the man clearly many years after his death.
Stephen Fox, we have callers on the line who want to talk with you. I'm going to ask those callers to speak up because sometimes when we have a phone guest and callers on the line, we have a little trouble hearing one another. Let's go to our first call from Poynette. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Fox?
Yes.
I'm wondering how much you know about Muir's life before he left the university.
It's quite a bit, actually. The materials are quite heavy for the college years because he goes away to college and he misses his family. So there are lots of letters back and forth, and they kept them. The Muir family preserved them. So there's a very heavy record there. For the period before he comes to the university, for the first 23 years of his life, it's thinner. And essentially what we have there to rely on are his recollections. He published an autobiography late in life, drawn from dictated reminiscences that he made when he was, 70 years old or so. So that has to be used more carefully because that's his memories of his youth filtered through old age. There are fewer direct records there. But for his time from the time he leaves home, 1861, there's a lot of correspondence, so you can track him.
Are you still with us, caller?
Yes.
Does that answer your question?
Well, we have a historical marker here right by Poynette, and his family lived in Montello, right? Or that's up in Marquette County?
That's right. That's the closest. That was the closest town. Yeah.
Okay. And the marker here, the historical marker, says that he used to walk from Montello down to Madison.
I can believe it. It's a long hike.
Yeah.
He would do it because he wanted to look at the trees and the plants.
Yeah.
and it would become just a long botanical excursion. Remember, the man walked 1,000 miles through the South in 1867, so that's really not such a big hike for him. He had a very strong, durable body. He was wiry, a great walker. All that farm work as a kid gave him a very strong constitution, so he could do prodigies of endurance in the wilderness. When he was in Yosemite, he'd go out for a week with 3 days rations and not mind. He was very ascetic, very disciplined, very Scotch, if you will. So he could do these things, extraordinary physical feats.
Well, thank you.
Thanks very much for joining us. Stephen Fox, in many ways, John Muir seems to be a embodiment of lots of contradictions.
Yes.
He comes from a very highly industrious sort of farm background. He ends up in a place like Indianapolis, which is a city working in a factory. For somebody who is really an environmentalist and a naturalist, isn't that a strange place to be?
Yes.
In many ways, his family clearly treasured his letters and so on, and yet I assume from that Scottish Presbyterian background, hard work and regular jobs would have been a more admirable career. No?
Yes, I'm sure his family wrote him off as a kind of proto-hippie, because he took a long time to settle down to regular employment and his own family. The rest of the family is quite conventional. And then there is John Muir, the third child, the firstborn son of 8 children. And he just developed himself on his own. It's hard to know how much of this was true before he leaves home for college, because just looking back, he said, well, of course, I always liked nature, and I had certain preservationist instincts. It's not clear that that was true. I think that may be the way he wanted to remember it in old age. But I think it all probably stems from when he leaves home and he spends the 2 years at UW and starts to think about these natural issues, and then spends those years in the woods thinking about them more and coming up with his point of view. It's entirely self-generated. He is very much an original. It's hard to explain him in terms of his family background, except in terms of fleeing that background. But he comes back to it. I mean, all his life he was very hard-working, too hard-working. There's that long period in the 1880s when he isn't writing just because he's running the fruit ranch, and he's so punctilious that he can't let go of it. He won't hire people to run it for him and take time off and do his writing or go off in the wilderness. He spends years without going into the wilderness in the 1880s. Then finally one of his brothers comes out and takes over running the farm, and at that point, around 1890, Muir finally says, okay, I can let it go, and he resumes his writing career.
We have many more callers who want to talk with you, Stephen Fox. We're moving now to a caller from Gillette. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'm very interested in when you were discussing the fact that he changed from a Christian way of thinking to the one that progressed into what he finally ended up with.
Yes.
I'm not sure what name I would put onto it.
It's hard to give it a name.
Yes, I don't see how he would find a conflict between the Christian thinking, if you take into consideration that everything is here from man's use, but only if he is supposed to also use it responsibly. I don't see how that would conflict with a naturalist thinking. As long as we can use it wisely, not destroy it, preserve it, we still can have use of it. It is there for our own use, or the human's use. Am I making myself clear? Maybe not.
Yes, I understand. There is a Christian ecological tradition. In the last 20 years in particular, Christians have plucked out quotations from here and there in the Bible, and you can construct a cosmology that is both Christian and friendly to non-human nature. It can be done. But to me, it is more a historical question than a theological one. The question is, how have Christians behaved toward the natural world? Who have been the great despoilers and exploiters and misusers of the natural world? And it seems to me it's people in Western Christian industrialized countries that have done that. That must mean something. The key text here that is always quoted is Genesis 1:28. Go forth, subdue the earth, and establish dominion over all her creatures. Now, the Christian ecological point of view says that what is meant that the words subdue and dominion are mistranslations, and it should be something more like stewardship and care. That point of view is there, that's true. But the real issue to me is who has a soul and who gets to heaven. Most of the religious traditions of the world say that humans have a soul, but so do bears and trees and maybe rocks. Christianity and Islam are practically the only two that say only humans are anointed in that way. And that attitude, it seems to me, elevates humans above every other form of life and gives them special privileges. There's been great debates about this among Christian theologians, and it seems to me there is no really identifiable Christian tradition that is friendly to nature. You can manufacture one, but just looking at the way people have behaved, seems to me that Christians have much to answer for. They have many fine things, too. Bear in mind, I was raised a Christian, and I suppose I have some vestiges of that still, but it is hard to excuse that human arrogance that I find implicit in the Christian point of view.
Gillette Caller, I want to thank you for taking time to be part of our program today. We're going to move on now to a caller from Stoughton. Go ahead, please.
When I was teaching elementary school children, I read a beautiful story called Big Tree. It's by Mary and Conrad Buff. And in the end, it tells about the sequoia trees in California, how they came to be through a seed that was no bigger than a needle. And by the end of the story, the tree, this one special tree, is about 2,500 years old.
Yeah.
And in the last page, it will say that it was John Muir that saved the sequoia trees.
He did a lot. He loved trees more than any other form of life, probably more than he loved humans. They were the biggest and the oldest of all forms of life, and they did no harm. They just stood there performing their useful functions, and the sequoias in particular. Imagine a living thing that's been alive for 2,000 and 3,000 years. It's just boggling. And many of them were in Yosemite and near Yosemite, and as a result, Muir's being the main force behind the establishment of Yosemite National Park saved a great many of these trees.
How big a battle was that? How much at risk were the sequoias before Muir?
Greatly. And it was a matter of local interest versus the national interest. In any environmental issue, especially in the West, where most of the public land, wilderness is located in this country, it usually comes down to local commercial interests. Loggers, miners, cattlemen, stockmen of various kinds, who want to use the land and actually abuse the land in many cases. And then a national constituency, which Muir and the Century magazine helped organize in 1890, that wants to save them. And it's simply a collision of short-term self-interest, the people who want to make commercial use of them, dynamiting a sequoia so you can use it for grape steaks, for heaven's sake, against this national constituency that thinks in a longer term. I mean, it's a view of history in a way. Do you think of short-term, immediate personal gain, or do you think in some longer term? The people who want to make commercial use of them, dynamiting a sequoia so you can use it for grape steaks, for heaven's sake, against this national constituency that thinks in a longer term. I mean, it's a view of history in a way. Do you think of short-term, immediate personal gain, or do you think in some longer term, more like a sequoia term, millennia, and national interest? Let's save these trees for everybody and for the millennia instead of letting some lumberman make a quick buck from them. But that was the collision, and that's been the collision over and over. It's local commercial interest with a very strong personal advantage to be gained trying to get hold of this land, and then the national constituency, which is less personally involved and a little harder to motivate because of that, but which takes a longer view of history, that thinks of history as past and future as well as just the present moment.
Stoughton Caller, thanks. We appreciated your being with us today, and we're moving now to somebody from Shell Lake. It's your turn. Go ahead, please, Shell Lake Caller.
Yes. Comparing Thoreau to Muir, I think one of the deciding differences is that Thoreau spoke of not being able to bring men's minds close together, and I think Thoreau thought the people in the environment, they carried the seeds of destruction, and he was primarily pessimistic. while Muir was more mentally healthy. He saw possibilities, and he was more constructive in his outlook in life. Would your guest agree with that?
Yes, but with this proviso that Thoreau died so young, it's hard to know what he would have become. He died at an age when Muir was just barely becoming John Muir, and if Thoreau had lived another 30 years, who knows, he might have even married and become relatively normal for a while. But yes, Muir was more engaged with the world and had a lot more time to do it in than Thoreau.
Does that respond to your question, Shell Lake caller? I think maybe we've lost our Shell Lake caller. Thanks for being with us. Now on to Whitefish Bay.
Yes, I have a comment. I think that I had read about John Muir that he had one sister whom he helped to get to the University of Wisconsin by supporting her there. And I wonder if she wasn't the one who saved the letters.
I think it was probably his mother who saved the letters home, at least that he sent to the old homestead. Muir was especially close to an older sister, Sarah, and I know that he had at least two younger sisters, Mary and another name that slips my mind, that he did help go to the university, and also a couple of brothers. He was very generous to his family. Was the first one to get out in the world in a way, and felt responsible for helping the others get out in the world from what was really a very oppressive environment. Their father was a religious nut, and he made home very uncomfortable for everybody in his zeal. And so once Muir got away and experienced the wider world and began to realize what was out there, he was very careful to pull other siblings along and away.
Well, it sounds to me as though it would have been very, very difficult, though, for him to be financially generous, given his employment pattern.
Mm-hmm.
How substantive was that support to siblings?
Well, it was quite. I don't know where he got the money exactly. He worked in those factories, the factory in Canada, then the factory in Indianapolis, and he was promoted. And he worked very hard. He always worked hard. Even when he was just out in the woods, he was active, and he worked long hours and got promotions and bonuses and was constantly tinkering and making devices to increase production. And I think that's it. He just earned the money. He lived very simply. He never spent any money on himself, and he had this extra cash to send to his siblings to get them away from home and to the university as well.
We've been talking about his relation to his birth family. What about his marriage and his children? What kind of father was he, and what kind of husband?
It's hard to say. It's one of the great mysteries of him. He marries late a woman named Louise Strenzel, daughter of Polish immigrants in California. And it was a very gradual courtship that his friends did not know about, and it just seems to me that it was less a matter of love and passion and more a matter of practicality. He wanted a fixed base, he wanted a home, he wanted children, and the Strenzels were quite wealthy. And I think, ever the Scotsman, that these aspects were very important to him. And then he's married, and he's only married for 25 years. Louis dies in 1905, and they're married in 1880. So most of his life he was not married, and in the marriage, they were very different people. She was very religious in a Christian way, a Methodist, and sober. There are maybe 2 or 3 photographs of her, and she doesn't smile. She looks uncomfortable, ill at ease. She was very smart and bookish. She was a fine mother and a dutiful wife, but the details are not there, partly because Louis' papers are still locked up. She's been dead for 83 years now, and her papers are housed at the same place, the University of the Pacific in California, that houses Muir's papers. Muir's papers are open, hers are not. And there's not much about her in Muir's papers, just a few letters that aren't terribly revealing. He loved his daughters. He had 2 daughters, and entertained them. They loved him, remained extravagantly loyal to him after his death, protecting his reputation, keeping his papers locked up for whatever reasons. The reasons are not known. But still one had the sense. He told a writer once. In 1903, a writer came to see the famous man at his home in Martinez. And Muir said, "This is a fine place," meaning the home in Martinez, "to keep your specimens in, to come in out of the storms, and to raise children. But it's not my home." He said, "Up there," and then he pointed toward the distant Sierra Nevada. He said, "Up there is my home." He always remained attached to those mountains and to the wilderness, and a little restive about being in civilization. It never quite suited him.
Go ahead, please.
May I ask another question?
Sure.
Wasn't he a mystic? In one of the books that I read about him, he supposedly was on the way to his mother's deathbed, but that on the way he realized that she was dead.
Yes,
he got off the train and went back to where he had started.
That's about true. In both cases, this is the 1890s, he's living in California, and he gets a sudden precognition that he must go home. And that was no small thing to get from San Francisco, Oakland, California to rural Wisconsin in the 1890s. It was a long trip by the train. But in both cases, this is separated over several years. He has a sudden flash that he must go home. And in both cases, he goes home, and soon thereafter, one of the parents dies. He has other psychic experiences, too, in the wilderness, and becomes interested in such things, collects articles on the subject. And in his dictated autobiography in 1908, he attaches a final section where he talks about them. He calls them mysterious things. That's his phrase. And finally says, well, someday we'll figure them out. There's something going on there. There's something real about this. And it seems to me that attaches to his religious views, too. Historically, Christianity has been very skeptical of paranormal experiences, psychic experiences, has tended to see them as a heresy, and other religious points of view have been more open to them. It's connected with his pantheism and his paganism, seems to me.
Thanks for being with us from Whitefish Bay today. We're once again going to let stations in our network identify themselves. You're listening to Wisconsin Public Radio. I'm Margaret Andreasen, talking today with Stephen Fox, author of The American Conservation Movement, John Muir and His Legacy, on this 150th birthday of John Muir. If you'd like to join our conversation, just give us a call. If you're in Madison or Milwaukee, you can use a local number, 263-1890, 263-1890. And if you're calling from any place else in Wisconsin, you can do that toll-free by using our 800 number, 1-800-642-1234. Again, 1-800-642-1234. We invite you also to stay with us here on Wisconsin Public Radio. Anything Goes this afternoon at 2:30 with Gene Faraka. Gene's guest is veteran Broadway director Neil Kenyon. He's directing Wisconsin's most recent revival of the Cole Porter musical, Anything Goes. Then at 3:30 today, Monitor Radio with a roundup and analysis of the day's news. At 4 o'clock, stay with us for All Things Considered. Now back to our telephones. Next caller is from Appleton. Hi there. Go ahead, please.
Yes. There seems to have been a lot of reference made to Muir's spiritual context, to spiritual attitudes, and some statements that have been made don't necessarily sit right. I was just calling. My first question is, did he ever make an open declaration of having any religious beliefs?
Oh, all the time. But he couched it in vague terms because he didn't want to offend people. He was writing for a Christian audience, after all, at the turn of the century in the United States, and his wife was a very strong Christian. But he always returned to the big issue, which is that love and appreciation of nature denies a godless mechanical universe. He saw great intentionality and purpose in everything, the way nature fits together in its mysterious processes. This is all, in his mind, it all leads to religious belief, the sort of argument from design. It's such a marvelous machine. It's not a machine, but such a marvelous panoply of wonder must have been created by some divine force. Now, he didn't go into any details, and in his lifetime, the precise nature of his religion was very much a secret. He didn't want to offend people. But it's clear from his unpublished letters and diaries that the point of view is there.
It seems to me that not so much that he was in object in objection to the basis of Christianity, or what he was actually representing was against anything that was scripturally sound in the Christian doctrines, but that basically he was against fundamental Christianity, or some of the religious misconnotations of Christianity. I'm sure. Is there any reference made to the fact that he himself ever did any study of Scripture or anything like that?
As a child he did, yes. As a child, supposedly he memorized most of the Bible, could recite it.
Okay, yeah.
The whole thing.
Because I think he was probably just a man out of place in his time, and very much in touch with the true essence of Christian faith. Especially when you made statements to the fact that he believed in the souls of animals and the souls of the earth and the souls of trees and so on and so forth. That is an establishment that's overlooked in basic Christian religion that is very much a part of the essence of Scripture. Like in Genesis, where God says he established a covenant with Noah, his family, and with every living soul that is among Noah and his family, all the fowl, all the beasts, every living creature in the earth. And he called them souls. And probably Muir was just ahead of his religious era.
As you imagine the Christian heaven, are there bears there?
Definitely. And the lion will lay with the lamb? Of course. Of course. It's scripturally sound. What you're representing Muir to have believed is very much the essence of true Christianity. Not religious Christianity, but scriptural sound Christianity.
Well, that argument can be made. I can't agree with it, but many people feel as you do. That's true.
Thanks for sharing your views with us, Appleton. We're going to go now to a caller from Muskota. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'm enjoying the program very, very much. I wonder, could you describe briefly how we remember John Muir? Do we remember him in statues or names of schools or streets? How have we remembered him?
Well, he has been institutionalized. There are many things and places named for him. Supposedly, in California, there are more places named for John Muir than for anybody else. I think it's the ideas that come down to us most and that mean the most. The man himself was beguiling, fascinating, and it's interesting to try to get at that personality. No one has done it yet. No Muir biographer has captured the man, what he was like in a room, what he was like in conversation or as a friend. But really it's the ideas about the human place in the natural world, about the need for respecting all forms of life on this planet, and for a certain forbearance about human designs on the wilderness, and for flattening that mountain and redirecting that river. Those are the ideas that really resonate today, and those ideas are readily available. His books are reprinted over and over in many editions. Most of his books are available in paperback reprints, many of them from the University of Wisconsin Press. They have made a cottage industry of Muir books over the years. So the words are there, the books are there, they can be bought and studied, and that's the Muir that matters, it seems to me, those ideas, because he was so different from his time. Remember, he's emerging from the industrializing, urbanizing, progress-oriented 19th century, when very few people questioned these things. 19th century was on a riot of industrial development. And Muir stands back from it and says the emperor has no clothes. It's an extraordinary act of recognition and independence on his part. And that's the Muir that really comes down to me, and the Muir that matters most now, it seems to me, 150 years after his birth.
Stephen Fox, which of John Muir's writings would you most recommend to individuals not familiar with him? What would be the greatest legacy novices could latch on to?
I would say there's a one-volume collection of his journals. John of the Mountains, I think, is the title it goes on. It was published in 1938. And someone went through his unpublished journals and picked out good selections here and there. That's the Muir, because you see, it's the private Muir. His books are good, but when he wrote for publication, he was always aware of who was going to read it, and especially in old age, he tended to trim some of his ideas. But you can get the essential Muir from that collection of journals.
Thanks very much for calling us today from Muskota. We're going to go now to somebody from Poynette. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I was just wondering about all this talk about Christianity. Christianity as a religion in many different forms has lasted for nearly 2,000 years and practically spans the globe. As far as John Muir is concerned, aren't we just talking about Scotch Presbyterian among immigrants to the United States around the mid-1800s. That's very specific, and to talk about different personal or academic points of interpretation of Scripture and all this stuff, isn't that sort of making the issue vague and really unattainable?
I do believe that the generalizations I've been making about Christianity apply to most forms of Christianity. Christianity has done wonderful things, don't mistake me, and in a way I feel like this is a diversion from Muir too much. But
yes. Yes. I think if we want to do a program on the essence of Christianity, we should do that at another time.
Yeah.
But I think, Stephen Fox, maybe you could just very, very briefly, in one or two sentences, tell us which specific tenets of Christianity you are referring to here. It seems to me you've already referred a couple of times to the fact that Christianity assumes that humans have souls that are somehow better than whatever animals happen to have, or trees or rocks.
That's right. To me, the core of Christianity, the reason it has succeeded so well for thousands of years, is its human-centeredness. That is its glory and its limitation. It's a fine thing for humans to entertain high opinions of themselves. It makes them ambitious and entrepreneurial and bustling. They go forth and subdue the earth and establish dominion over all the creatures, just like Genesis said. But there is a dark, arrogant underside to that human-centeredness that leads to environmental abuse.
Jesus died to save mankind, not rocks
Yes.
and pigs and
Yes,
trees.
that's right.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for joining us from Poinet. Now on to Portage. Hi there.
Hi. I wish John Muir were alive today to see what's happening east of Portage here. My father lives on Highway 33 East, which is undergoing restoration. A couple of days ago we saw, and about the first time I saw tears in my dad's eyes for a long time. He's 75 years old. There were a row of hickory trees and two great big old oak trees, and we tried for 2 years to save these trees, and they were right on the line of being cut or not cut, and well, they didn't even have the dignity of being cut. A giant bulldozer dug a hole so deep you couldn't even see the dozer anymore alongside these trees, and they were subsequently pushed over.
That's a shame. You're right near Muir's home there, aren't you?
Yes, yeah, right north of my dad's place is a park, John Muir Park.
Is that right?
But in this modern day and age, we still haven't learned. We're spending millions of dollars in beautifying Highway 51 with prairie grasses, trying to get it back to the way it was. And here where these trees had to be over 200 years old. In fact, this winter, for the first time, my dad, all winter long, a bald eagle, believe it or not, a bald eagle landed in one of these trees.
Wow.
And within, 100 yards, less than 100 yards from the outbuildings. And, and these hickory trees, my mother said 43 years she made hickory nut cakes from the hickory nuts of these hickory nut trees. And you talk to these guys, are professional people, like people in the DOT. I don't blame anybody because I guess it's the progress, but I mean, there's somebody to blame. There's somebody that put their signature on these trees to be cut, or not even cut, to be bulldozed over. And we haven't learned yet today that the beauty of these trees far surpasses maybe the little bit of safety of getting these trees out of the way of people going by 65 miles an hour. And it was just a sad day all this week at my dad's farm.
Wisconsin is very environmentally aware as states go. Margaret, you alluded to this earlier, and I think the reason may be that so much of the state has remained wild, that it has not been overgrown with, quote, progress, unquote, and everybody seems to have their cottage out west or up north, and people get out there in the woods, and it's good for them. It changes their perspective.
Yes, what our caller, though, is talking about, I think, is the old homestead. People who don't have to move to their cottages to still appreciate whatever is wild or natural or real here in other parts of Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. Well, we appreciate your joining us today, Portage caller. I'm really sorry to hear about those trees. And I guess maybe progress seems too high a price. It has to have too high a price when this is what's happening. Thanks for being with us today. Others of you who would like to talk with Stephen Fox can do that just by giving us, excuse me, I'm having trouble here, just by giving us a call. If you're in Madison or Milwaukee, dial 263-1890, 263-1890, and if you're calling from any place else in Wisconsin, you can do that without cost to you by using our 800 number, 1-800-642-1234. Again, 1-800-642-1234. I've asked questions about Muir and money before. Let me take that one step farther. To what extent does conservation require money, and to what extent was Muir able to generate funds for whatever conservation practices he wished to see initiated?
He spent a certain amount of money, especially an issue at the end of his life, the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir in Yosemite. The city of San Francisco decided to dam a valley within Yosemite Park and use it as a water tank. And it was the struggle, the denouement of his life, which he lost. They made it a water tank. And in that case, he spent a considerable amount of his own money on the campaign, the costs of publicity and organizing and so on, the politicking costs. In general, he didn't, though. In general, he wrote articles and wrote books and gave talks, and none of that cost much money. But you do raise an issue here that has bedeviled the environmental movement over the years, and that has been that over the years it has been mostly the province of people of relative privilege, people of relative education and income, and it's easy to dismiss it as simply a thing of the privileged class. Well, that's true. There are various reasons for it, but the one that comes to mind is that I think it requires a certain awareness of the world that is usually only a matter of some education and sophistication and a broad view. Most of us, most of the time, are so focused on the task in front of us, what we're going to do today, what we're going to do tonight. It's very hard to step back from that and take a long-range historical view, but you must do that to have an environmental point of view. It's a way of regarding history, it seems to me. I'm a historian, so maybe that's my particular shtick, but it's a view of history. It's a long view of history, past and future, and that just inherently is a matter of certain kinds of people. It has never been very popular among working class people, probably for that reason.
Well, presumably, it takes a certain amount of discretionary time to engage in that kind of meditation, to travel about in order to get this broader perspective.
Yes.
And we don't find very many working class people, or even what we refer to as executives, having the leisure and discretion to do that.
True. That's part of it. Although the working class has its amusements, they just, in general, don't choose to go out into the woods. Their amusements tend to be indoors and nearby. And there again, I suppose money and time come in. If you're going to go on a camping trip for 2 weeks in Yosemite, that requires a certain amount of money and time, yes.
We have many more callers, and we're just out of time. I guess I'd like to thank you, Stephen Fox, for taking your time today to be part of our program. It's kind of nice to celebrate John Muir's birthday this way, having you with us here in Wisconsin. Stephen Fox, author of The American Conservation Movement, John Muir and His Legacy. Thanks again.